Howdy, friends. Fancy Dud's recording day, how it goes. Taking a little break between trying to get everything put together for Sunday. So I thought I would share something I mentioned yesterday, talking about the easy answers. How do you know how you're supposed to live your life? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? The golden rule shows up in pretty much all of the world's religions, some way, shape, or form of how we're supposed to take care of people. But in the Gospel of Matthew specifically, it's part in this story. So I'm going to read that for you, the direct words of Scripture rather than just an interpretation. So this is from Matthew 22, and it says, "When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked a question to test him. 'Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest?' And he said to them, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.'" So this first part, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, that is called the Shema. It's in Deuteronomy. It is the basis of all, I guess you call it Jewish teaching, all kind of stems from this basic idea. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Right? This is the piece that you learn as a child in the Jewish faith, and at least in my house, this is one that I won't say we ever had to memorize per se, but it was clearly a guiding factor in all that we did. You love God, and you love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we know the story goes on a little bit differently in other parts where one of these lawyers, one of the people in the church, somebody who's trying to get a gotcha question is like, okay, so who's my neighbor, right? And then Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Got it, okay. Different story, different idea. I'm not going to go that way. But this idea of love God, love your neighbor, and he says, hang all of the law and prophets on this. It doesn't mean you don't need to pay attention to anything else. That's not what Jesus ever said, because Jesus, above all things, was Jewish. He was not a Christian because Christianity didn't exist. He wasn't looking to found a religion after his own name. That's not what he was about. He was about other things altogether. But this idea of hang all the law, hang everything else, it means once you figured out those two things, then you worry about everything else. Now, as Christians, we frequently will say, okay, once you figured out those, all those other pieces should already be in place or are moot because you figured out the two big things. So how do you love God? How do you love God with all your soul, your mind, your strength, with your whole being, with your very essence, right? There are countless series, volumes, books, libraries upon this topic. How do you love God in all you do? Depending on who you talk to, they can give you different answers. We'll get back to that some other time. How do you love your neighbor as yourself? And I guess the better question in today's day and age, with everything going on around us, is how do you love yourself? Right? If you don't take care of yourself, how can you possibly take care of your neighbor? If you take care of yourself poorly, is that how you want to take care of your neighbor? Right? Big questions. So I'm going to give you a real quick piece on what we in the clergy world, but I think elsewhere, we call self-care. It means taking care of yourself, not above others, but making sure your needs are met so that you can take care of others. So often you'll see this metaphor of a sponge, right? There's two ways to do it. You pour the water on the sponge, and then you squeeze it out until it's dry, and there's nothing left. And then in order for the sponge to do anything with water again, you have to refill it. And while that metaphor works for some, if you've ever gotten to that point in your life where you're bone dry and you've got nothing left, you should recognize quickly that when you hit that point, you're not a pleasant person to be around. And if you don't hit that point, just ask someone you live with and they'll let you know that you do hit that point. So let's just be clear on that. The other way to think of it, if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself then, is the sponge, is to think as the water is going into the sponge and you're squeezing, it's to let it out in a slow, steady stream. Sometimes a little bit more when it's needed, sometimes a little less when it's needed, but you never empty yourself completely. Because when you empty yourself completely, it's hard to love your neighbor. So in this day and age, I want to encourage you to give you permission, if you need it, to take care of yourself. Because you cannot take care of the people you love unless you take care of yourself. Just trust me on this one. It's not something that's not true. It's just what it is. One of the ways I take care of myself, some of you have probably heard me talk about it, is I hop on my bicycle and the world just kind of vanishes between me and my pedals. It's a way I do self-care. I also, I like Star Wars, right? You probably have remembered that. I do a lot of Star Wars books and shows with Hannah and playing with that, but also listening to stuff that happens way out in space because it's got absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in the world. So I'm going to encourage you in this kind of lengthy message, what can you do to take care of yourself? What can you do to take care of yourself so that when the time comes to take care of others, you've got the energy, the strength, and the care to do that as well? Talk to y'all soon.